The call came at 4:47 in the morning, piercing through the January darkness like a blade through silk. Isabella Brown's hand fumbled across the nightstand, knocking over a half-empty glass of water before finding her phone. The screen's cold glow illuminated her face, still creased from the pillow, eyes struggling to focus on the name. Sheriff's Department. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you like the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon. Ms. Brown. The voice on the other end was steady, professional, but beneath it ran an undercurrent of something else. Urgency, maybe fear. This is Deputy Marcus Hayes. I'm sorry to call so early, but we need you to come down to the station. It's about your mother. Isabella sat up, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. The bedroom of her small rental house in Millbrook, Tennessee felt smaller in the darkness, the walls pressing in. My mother? What about her? Ma'am, I can't discuss details over the phone, but I need you to know we've made an arrest in her case. After all these years, we finally have someone in custody. The phone nearly slipped from Isabella's fingers. 34 years. 34 years since that October night in 1991 when her mother, Caroline Brown, had been found in the back office of Brown's hardware store, the family business that had served Millbrook for 3 generations. 34 years since 9-year-old Isabella had become the girl whose mother was murdered, whose face appeared in newspaper photographs with haunted eyes and a black dress too big for her small frame. Who? The word came out as barely a whisper. Please come to the station, Ms. Brown. Sheriff Williams will explain everything. The line went dead. Isabella sat in the darkness for a full minute, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Around her, the house held its silence. The old radiator ticking, the refrigerator humming its lonely song in the kitchen, the creak of settling wood that she'd grown accustomed to over the past year since moving back to Millbrook. She'd left this town when she was 18, swearing never to return, and yet here she was at 43, pulled back by forces she couldn't fully name or resist. Her hands shook as she dressed. Jeans, a sweater, boots, moving mechanically through motions that felt both too slow and too fast. In the bathroom mirror, she saw her mother's eyes staring back at her. The same deep brown, the same slight downward tilt at the outer corners that made them look perpetually sad even when smiling. Isabella had inherited Caroline's high cheekbones too, her small frame, her habit of biting her lower lip when thinking. The drive to the sheriff's station took 8 minutes through empty streets. Millbrook had barely changed since her childhood. The same brick storefronts lining Main Street, the same Methodist church with its white steeple catching the first hints of dawn, the same stoplight at Oak and Jefferson that still swung too wildly in the wind. Population 3,847. The sign at the town limits proclaimed, same number it had been in 1991. The station occupied a renovated Victorian house on Elm Street, its original gingerbread trim painted a cheerful yellow that felt obscene given the nature of the business conducted inside. Isabella parked her old Honda Civic beside 2 patrol cars and a black SUV she didn't recognize. Her legs felt unsteady as she climbed the front steps, each footfall echoing in the pre-dawn quiet. Deputy Hayes met her at the door. He was young, couldn't have been more than 25. With kind eyes and a nervous energy that suggested this was the biggest case he'd ever worked. Ms. Brown, thank you for coming so quickly. Sheriff Williams is waiting in his office. Can I get you some coffee? No, thank you. Isabella's voice sounded foreign to her own ears. Too calm, too controlled. Just tell me what's happening. Hayes led her down a hallway lined with photographs of previous sheriffs dating back to 1892. Sheriff Thomas Williams stood as she entered his office, a bear of a man in his early 60s with silver hair and a face carved by decades of Tennessee sun and hard conversations. He'd been a deputy back in 1991, one of the first responders to the scene. Isabella remembered him crouching down to her eye level, his voice gentle as he asked her questions she couldn't answer then and still couldn't answer now. Isabella. He didn't call her Ms. Brown, and somehow that small familiarity steadied her. Sit down, please. She sank into the chair across from his desk. On the wall behind him hung a map of Millbrook and surrounding Davidson County, stuck with colored pins marking incidents and investigations. A red pin still marked the location of Brown's hardware store on Main Street. "We arrested Eleanor Whitfield 2 hours ago," Williams said, his words falling like stones into still water. Isabella's breath stopped. "Mrs. Whitfield? Eleanor Whitfield, who taught 5th grade. Who organized the church bake sales?" "The same." The world tilted. Eleanor Whitfield had been her mother's friend. Not a close friend perhaps, but a presence in their lives. A woman who brought casseroles after Caroline's divorce from Isabella's father, who helped with the annual Christmas toy drive, who had hugged 9-year-old Isabella at the funeral and whispered that Caroline was watching over her from heaven. "I don't understand," Isabella said, though even as she spoke, fragments of memory began shifting, rearranging themselves into new and terrible patterns. Williams opened a folder on his desk, though he didn't look at its contents. He'd clearly memorized every detail. 3 weeks ago, a woman named Patricia Chun contacted us. She'd been Mrs. Whitfield's student in 1991, was in her classroom the day of the murder. Patricia's been in therapy for trauma, and during her sessions, she began recovering suppressed memories. She remembered seeing Mrs. Whitfield leave the school that afternoon, October 15, 1991, with what looked like blood on her sleeve. Mrs. Whitfield told her it was paint from the art room, but Patricia said something about it never sat right with her. Isabella's hands gripped the armrests of her chair. "That's not evidence. A memory from 34 years ago, from a child." "No, it's not. But it was enough to get us looking closer." Williams pulled a photograph from the folder. "We obtained a warrant to search the Whitfield property. In the attic, sealed in a plastic container, we found this." He turned the photograph toward her. Isabella's vision swam. It was a scarf silk, patterned with autumn leaves in shades of amber and burgundy. Her mother's scarf, the one she'd been wearing the day she died, the one that had never been found at the crime scene. "We ran DNA tests. Your mother's blood is on this scarf, along with Eleanor Whitfield's skin cells and hair. The blood pattern suggests the scarf was used in the struggle." Williams's voice was gentle but relentless. "We also found your mother's wedding ring in the same container, the ring that was missing from her hand when we found her body." The room felt airless. Isabella remembered that ring. A simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the light when her mother moved her hands, which she did often, speaking with her whole body, animated and alive and so utterly dead now for so long that sometimes Isabella struggled to remember the sound of her laughter. "Why?" The question emerged as a broken thing, all jagged edges. "Why would she? They were friends. My mother helped her. They served on committees together. We don't know yet. Mrs. Whitfield hasn't said a word since we arrested her. She invoked her right to an attorney immediately." Williams leaned forward. "But Isabella, I need you to know we're going to find out. After all these years of questions, we're finally going to get you answers." Isabella looked at the map on the wall, at the red pin marking the place where her life had fractured. The hardware store had closed 15 years ago, sold to a corporation that turned it into a dollar store. But in her mind, it would always be Brown's hardware, would always smell like sawdust and paint and the lavender perfume her mother wore, would always be the place where childhood ended. "There's something else," Williams said, and Isabella forced her gaze back to him. "We need you to be prepared. This is going to bring everything back into the light. The press, the speculation, the trial. Millbrook is a small town, and this is going to shake it to its foundations." Through the office window, Isabella could see the sky beginning to pale toward dawn. Somewhere in this town, in a holding cell, Eleanor Whitfield sat with 34 years of secrets finally dragged into the open. Somewhere, Patricia Chun was probably awake, grappling with the weight of being the catalyst. And here, in this office that smelled like bad coffee and old paper, Isabella felt the past and present colliding with the force of a head-on crash. "Can I see her?" Isabella asked. "Mrs. Whitfield? I don't think that's. I need to see her face." Isabella stood, her legs steadier now, driven by something she couldn't name. Not quite anger, not quite grief, something harder and more necessary. 34 years, Sheriff. I need to look her in the eye. William studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. 5 minutes. But she doesn't have to speak to you, and if her attorney arrives, 5 minutes is enough. As Isabella followed Hayes down another corridor toward the holding cells, she thought about the last time she'd seen her mother alive. It had been an ordinary Tuesday morning, hurried and mundane. Caroline had been running late, searching for her car keys while simultaneously making Isabella's lunch and trying to return a customer's phone call about a special order of wood stain. "Love you, baby," she'd called over her shoulder as Isabella headed out to catch the school bus. "Be good." Such small words to serve as a goodbye. Such insufficient words to carry the weight of all that would come after. The holding cell was at the end of the hall, and through the small window in the door, Isabella could see Eleanor Whitfield sitting on the narrow bench, her gray hair disheveled, her hands folded in her lap. She looked smaller than Isabella remembered, diminished somehow, though perhaps that was just the effect of seeing someone in a cell rather than standing at the front of a classroom or behind a table of baked goods. Hayes unlocked the door but remained outside. Isabella stepped into the cell, and Eleanor Whitfield looked up. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Isabella saw something she would spend the rest of her life trying to understand. Not defiance, not shame, not even fear. Just emptiness, vast and absolute, as if the person behind those eyes had disappeared long ago, leaving only this shell that breathed and moved and had somehow managed to keep walking through the world for 34 years while carrying the weight of what she'd done. "Why?" Isabella whispered. Eleanor Whitfield's mouth opened, closed. Her hands tightened in her lap, knuckles white. For a heartbeat, Isabella thought she might actually answer. But then the woman's face closed like a door slamming shut, and she looked away toward the cell's blank wall. Isabella stood there a moment longer, then turned and walked out. As Hayes locked the door behind her, she heard her phone buzzing in her pocket. Probably Aunt Judith, her mother's sister, who still lived in Millbrook and had likely already heard the news through the town's efficient gossip network. Or maybe it was Marcus, her ex-husband in Nashville, calling with awkward condolences. Or her daughter, Sophia, a college sophomore who'd grown up hearing stories about the grandmother she'd never met. But Isabella didn't reach for the phone. Instead, she walked back down the corridor, past the photographs of dead sheriffs, past the dispatch desk where a radio crackled with routine morning calls, out into the January dawn that was breaking cold and clear over Millbrook, Tennessee. Somewhere in this town was the truth, and Isabella was going to find it. Isabella drove home on autopilot, her mind 1,000 miles away and 34 years in the past. The sun had fully risen by the time she pulled into her driveway, painting the rental houses peeling white siding in shades of gold that felt too cheerful for the morning's revelations. She sat in the car for several minutes, hands still gripping the steering wheel, watching Mrs. Patterson from next door retrieve her newspaper in a pink bathrobe, oblivious to the earthquake that had just reshaped Isabella's world. Inside, the house felt different somehow, as if the news had physically altered its dimensions. Isabella moved through rooms that suddenly seemed like stage sets. The living room with its second-hand couch and milk crate coffee table. The kitchen where dishes from last night's solitary dinner still sat in the sink. The spare bedroom she'd converted into a makeshift office where she did freelance graphic design work that barely paid the bills. She'd come back to Millbrook a year ago after her divorce was finalized. After Sophia left for Vanderbilt. After 25 years of trying to outrun her past by living in Nashville, Chattanooga, even briefly in Charlotte. Always moving, always restless, never quite able to settle anywhere because the weight of unanswered questions followed her like a shadow. The therapist she'd seen for 3 years had called it complicated grief. Isabella called it Tuesday. The coffee pot gurgled to life at her touch, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought had failed. While it brewed, she stood at the kitchen window watching morning light filter through the bare branches of the oak tree in the backyard. The same oak that had been there when she was a child, when her mother was alive, when the world made a kind of sense that felt permanently lost now. Her phone buzzed. Aunt Judith, as predicted. Isabella let it go to voicemail, then listened as her aunt's voice, trembling with emotion, filled the kitchen. "Baby girl, I just heard. Sweet Jesus, Eleanor Whitfield. I just can't believe it. Call me when you can. I'm coming over. You shouldn't be alone." But Isabella wanted to be alone. alone with her thoughts, her memories, the careful reconstruction of her mother's last days that she'd performed countless times over the years, searching for clues she'd been too young to understand at 9, too traumatized to process at 19, too numb to feel at 29. She poured coffee into a mug that read "World's Best Mom," a gift from Sophia 3 Christmases ago, and carried it to the living room, settling into the worn armchair that had been her mother's. Isabella had bought it at an estate sale years ago, not realizing until she got it home and saw the label on the bottom that it was the same model Caroline had owned. Some gravitational pull toward the familiar, the lost, the irretrievably gone. The morning played out in fragments. Isabella called in sick to her main client, a Nashville marketing firm that kept her on retainer for web design work. She showered but couldn't remember doing it afterward. She changed clothes 3 times, unable to decide what one wore on the day your mother's murderer was finally named. She made toast she couldn't eat. She started to text Sophia, then deleted the message unsent. Her daughter was in the middle of exams, and this news could wait a few hours. Couldn't it? Or would waiting make it worse? At 10:15, Aunt Judith arrived without knocking, as she always did, bustling through the front door with enough energy for 3 people and a casserole dish of what looked like breakfast enchiladas. "I know you haven't eaten," she announced, heading straight for the kitchen. "And don't tell me you're not hungry. Grief needs fuel, baby." Judith Brown Matthews was 68 years old but moved like someone 20 years younger, all sharp angles and purposeful motion. She'd raised Isabella after Caroline's death, transforming overnight from the fun aunt who snuck extra cookies to the guardian who had to sign permission slips and attend parent-teacher conferences and hold a sobbing child through nightmares that lasted years. She'd never married, never had children of her own, poured all her formidable love and energy into making sure Isabella survived what should have destroyed her. "Talk to me," Judith said, setting plates on the coffee table with decisive clinks. "What did William say exactly? What evidence do they have?" Isabella recounted the conversation. The scarf, the ring, Patricia Chen's recovered memories. Judith listened with the intense focus she brought to everything, her dark eyes, so like Caroline's, so like Isabella's own, never leaving her niece's face. "Eleanor Whitfield," Judith said when Isabella finished, her voice carrying a weight of disgust. "That sanctimonious holier-than-thou." She caught herself, took a breath. "I never liked her. Something always felt off, you know? The way she smiled too much, talked too sweet. Your mama saw the good in everyone. But me? I didn't trust women who acted that perfect. You never said anything. What was I supposed to say? Caroline, I think your friend might be a murderer based on my gut feeling?" Judith shook her head. "I've spent 34 years wondering if I should have trusted my instincts more, spoken up somehow. But hindsight's 20/20 and worth about as much." Isabella picked at the enchiladas, managed a few bites to satisfy her aunt. The food tasted like cardboard, but that was her fault, not Judith's. Everything tasted like cardboard lately ever since. Actually, she couldn't remember when food had last tasted like anything. "I keep thinking about the day it happened," Isabella said quietly, trying to remember if there were signs, if Mrs. Whitfield acted strange, if Mama said anything. "Stop." Judith's voice was firm but gentle. "You were 9 years old. You're not responsible for not seeing what trained investigators missed for 3 decades. But I should remember more. I should. You remember what you remember. The mind protects itself, especially a child's mind." Judith reached across the coffee table and gripped Isabella's hand. "Listen to me, baby girl. You survived. That's what mattered then, and it's what matters now. You survived, and you built a life, and you raised a beautiful daughter, and you came back here even though it hurt because you needed to. That's enough. That's more than enough." Tears burned Isabella's eyes but wouldn't fall. They rarely did anymore. Somewhere around age 30, she'd seemed to run out of tears, or perhaps they'd just frozen inside her. An underground river of grief flowing constant but invisible. The morning dissolved into afternoon. Judith stayed, understanding without being told that Isabella needed both company and silence. They existed in the same space without demanding anything of each other. Judith working on her crossword puzzle. Isabella sitting at her laptop pretending to respond to work emails but actually searching online for any news articles about the arrest. There were already 3, the story spreading through regional media like wildfire. Tennessee cold case cracked. Teacher arrested in 1991 murder. Millbrook hardware store killing finally solved. DNA evidence links educator to decades-old homicide. Each article contained roughly the same information, padded out with background about the original case. Isabella had read these details so many times they'd become catechism. Caroline Brown, age 34, found dead in her family's hardware store at approximately 6:30 p.m. on October 15, 1991. Cause of death: blunt force trauma to the head, multiple blows with a weapon never recovered. No signs of sexual assault. Cash register untouched, suggesting robbery wasn't the motive. No forced entry. No witnesses. No arrests despite an intensive investigation. For years, the case had haunted Millbrook. Theories had proliferated like weeds. A stranger passing through town, a disgruntled customer, a secret lover. This one had infuriated Judith, who defended her sister's character with the ferocity of a lioness. The investigation had focused briefly on Caroline's ex-husband, Isabella's father, Robert Brown. But he'd been in Memphis that day with dozens of witnesses, and the lead had evaporated. Eventually, the case went cold, joining the ranks of unsolved murders that populate small towns' collective nightmares. And all that time, Eleanor Whitfield had been teaching 5th grade, organizing bake sales, singing in the church choir, living a normal life while Caroline's body moldered in Millbrook Cemetery and Isabella grew up without a mother. The rage came suddenly, a hot spike through Isabella's chest. She stood abruptly, startling Judith. "I need to go to the store," Isabella said. "The old store. Honey, it's a Dollar General now. There's nothing. I need to see it." Judith studied her face, then nodded. "Okay, I'll drive." The Dollar General occupied the same brick building that had housed Brown's Hardware for 73 years. 3 generations of Browns had run the business. Isabella's great-grandfather, who'd opened it in 1918, her grandfather, who'd expanded it in the 1950s, and Caroline, who'd taken it over in 1985 after her father's stroke. It had been more than a store. It had been a community gathering place, somewhere people came not just for hammers and paint, but for advice on home repairs, local gossip, and Caroline's famous sweet tea that she kept in a dispenser by the register. Now it sold cheap household goods and off-brand snacks, fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, everything the same corporate bland you'd find in 1,000 other stores across America. Isabella walked the aisles slowly, trying to overlay her childhood memories onto this sanitized present. The back office where her mother had died was now a storage room, accessible only to employees. Isabella stood outside its locked door, one hand pressed against the metal surface, feeling nothing and everything simultaneously. Ms. Brown, a young woman in a Dollar General vest, approached hesitantly. Her name tag read Kayla. "I'm sorry, employees only back here." "I know," Isabella said, but didn't move her hand from the door. "Are you?" Kayla's eyes widened with recognition. "Oh my God, you're her daughter, the lady who was killed here. I just saw the news. They arrested someone." "Yes, that must be so crazy for you. After all this time." Kayla shifted her weight awkwardly. "My mom went to school with you, actually. Rita Henderson? Well, Rita Garcia now." Isabella searched her memory, found a dim image of a girl with braces and a kind smile. "I remember Rita. She says your mom was real nice. Always helped people out, gave them extra time to pay if they were short." Kayla glanced at the storage room door. "Sometimes I think about it, that someone died here. When I'm doing inventory late at night, I wonder if she's still around somehow. But then I think if I were a ghost, I wouldn't stick around the place I died. I'd go be with my family." The simple logic of it struck Isabella with unexpected force. If Caroline's spirit existed anywhere, it wouldn't be in this fluorescent-lit storage room. It would be in the stories Judith told, in the cheekbones Isabella saw in the mirror, in the way Sophia laughed. A sound Isabella had only heard in old videos but which people said echoed Caroline's exactly. "Thank you," Isabella told Kayla, for saying that. Outside, the afternoon had turned gray, clouds rolling in from the west promising rain. Judith drove them to Millbrook Cemetery without asking, understanding that this was part of whatever ritual Isabella needed to complete today. Caroline's grave sat beneath a dogwood tree, the headstone simple granite. Caroline Louise Brown, 1957 to 1991, beloved mother, daughter, sister, her light still shines. Isabella had chosen those words when she was 18, trying to capture something essential about a woman she'd only known for 9 years. Looking at them now, they felt inadequate, too small to contain the entirety of a life. "Hi, Mama," Isabella said softly, crouching beside the headstone. Judith hung back, giving her space. "We got her. We finally got her." The wind picked up, rustling through the dogwood branches. In spring, this tree bloomed white and pink, covering the grave in delicate petals. Now, in January, it stood bare, all black branches against gray sky. "I wish I understood why," Isabella continued. "That's the part that I need to know why. What did you do that made her?" She stopped, bile rising in her throat. "You didn't do anything. That's not what I meant. You were just living your life, being yourself, being good and kind and—" The tears came finally, hot and fast, 30 years worth breaking through whatever dam had held them back. Judith's hand settled on her shoulder, a warm, steadying weight. They stayed until the rain began, soft at first, then harder. "On the drive home," Judith said, "your mama loved you more than anything in this world. You know that, right? Every decision she made, every hour she worked at that store, it was all for you. To give you a good life, opportunities, a future. I know. She'd be so proud of who you became. The mother you are to Sophia. The way you kept going even when it hurt. The strength it took to come back here." Judith's voice cracked slightly. "And she'd want you to find peace, baby. However that looks, whatever that takes. Even if it means facing down demons." That night, alone in her house with rain drumming against the windows, Isabella finally called Sophia. Her daughter answered on the second ring, her voice bright with youth and the casual assumption that the world was fundamentally safe. "Mom, I was just thinking about you. How's the project going?" Isabella had told her about a fictional web design project, something to explain her return to Millbrook without burdening her daughter with the full weight of unresolved trauma. Sophia knew the basics. Grandmother murdered, case unsolved. But Isabella had always kept the details vague, wanting to protect her from the darkness. "Actually, there's something I need to tell you," Isabella said. "They made an arrest. In your grandmother's case." Silence on the other end. "Then, what? When? Who?" Isabella explained, keeping her voice steady, clinical almost. Sophia listened without interrupting, and when Isabella finished, her daughter's first question was, "Are you okay?" Such a simple question. Such an impossible one to answer. "I'm processing," Isabella said carefully. "It's a lot. Do you want me to come home? I can skip my afternoon classes tomorrow. Be there by evening." "No, honey. Stay there. Finish your exams. I'm okay, really. Aunt Judith's here." "Mom." Sophia's voice carried that particular tone of knowing when she was being managed. "You don't have to protect me from this. I'm not a kid anymore. I know you're not. But right now, there's nothing you can do here except worry. And I need you to live your life, be young, be happy. That's what helps me most." They talked for another 20 minutes, Sophia asking questions Isabella couldn't answer yet, making her mother promise to call if she needed anything at all. After they hung up, Isabella sat with her phone in her lap, feeling the familiar ache of maternal love mixed with maternal failure. The sense that no matter how hard you tried, you couldn't shield your children from pain, could only hope you'd given them tools to survive it. At midnight, Isabella was still awake, lying in the dark scrolling through photos on her phone. There was one of her mother, digitized from an old print, taken at a church picnic in the summer of 1991. Caroline was laughing at something off camera, her head thrown back, pure joy evident in every line of her face. Eleanor Whitfield stood in the background of the photo, barely visible, holding a pitcher of lemonade. Isabella zoomed in on Eleanor's face, searching for signs of what she would do 3 months later. But there was nothing. Just a woman at a church picnic, smiling, ordinary, unremarkable. How did someone carry murder inside them and still look so normal? How did they sleep at night, grade papers, buy groceries, exist in the world with blood on their hands? What kind of person could sit at Caroline Brown's funeral and comfort her 9-year-old daughter while knowing they were the reason for her tears? Isabella didn't have answers, but she would find them. Whatever it took, however long the trial lasted. She would sit in that courtroom every single day and she would understand. The rain had stopped. Through her bedroom window, she could see stars emerging between breaking clouds, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked 3 times, then fell silent. Tomorrow she would wake up and begin the process of seeking truth. But tonight, in this quiet darkness, Isabella allowed herself to simply be, broken and whole, grieving and surviving, her mother's daughter in all the ways that mattered. The news spread through Millbrook like flood water, touching everything, transforming the town's familiar landscape into something strange and fraught. By Wednesday morning, 48 hours after Eleanor Whitfield's arrest, news vans from Nashville, Memphis, and even Atlanta had set up camp outside the Davidson County Courthouse. Reporters ambushed anyone willing to talk, and plenty were willing. Isabella watched it unfold from a distance at first, staying in her house, screening calls, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy while the world outside spun increasingly out of control. But on Wednesday afternoon, Sheriff Williams called with news that made isolation impossible. "Eleanor Whitfield is being arraigned tomorrow at 2 p.m., he said. "I wanted you to hear it from me before you saw it on the news. Her attorney is arguing for bail." "Bail?" Isabella's voice spiked. "For murder. Her lawyer's claiming she's not a flight risk. 70-year-old retired teacher, lived in the same house for 45 years, deep community ties. The DA's fighting it, but I wanted you prepared for the possibility." Isabella hung up and immediately called Judith, who arrived within 20 minutes carrying a pot of coffee and a grim determination. "We're going to that arraignment," Judith announced, "and we're going to make sure that Judge sees Caroline's family in that courtroom. Let Eleanor Whitfield look us in the eye." They went together, sitting in the front row of the courthouse gallery. Isabella wore the same black dress she'd worn to her mother's funeral. She'd kept it all these years, though it required taking in at the waist, her 43-year-old body smaller than her 18-year-old one had been. A deliberate choice, a visible reminder of the girl who'd lost everything. The courtroom filled quickly, reporters, curious townspeople, Eleanor Whitfield supporters, and there were supporters, Isabella was shocked to discover, the victims' advocates from the DA's office. Patricia Chan sat 3 rows back with her therapist, her face pale but resolute. When they brought Eleanor in, Isabella's breath caught. The woman looked diminished in her orange jumpsuit, her gray hair pulled back in a messy ponytail, her hands cuffed in front of her. But what struck Isabella most was the disconnect between the person she'd known, the cheerful teacher, the community volunteer, and this stranger who'd somehow hidden a monster inside for decades. Eleanor's attorney was a polished woman in her 40s named Rebecca Morrison from a Nashville firm. She argued eloquently for bail. Her client's age, her clean record, her terminal illness, this was news, stage 3 ovarian cancer, recently diagnosed, the presumption of innocence. The DA, a sharp-eyed black man named Jerome Washington, countered with equal force. The brutality of the crime, the decades of deception, the DNA evidence, the fact that Eleanor had kept trophies, the scarf, the ring, suggesting a level of psychological detachment that made her unpredictable. The judge, a stern woman named Patricia Holland, listened to both sides, then denied bail. Eleanor Whitfield would remain in custody pending trial. When the gavel fell, Isabella felt something uncoil in her chest. Not relief exactly, but a small sense of justice beginning to take shape. As they filed out, a reporter thrust a microphone toward Isabella. "Ms. Brown, how do you feel about today's decision?" Isabella opened her mouth, but Judith stepped between them. "We're grateful to the Davidson County Sheriff's Department for their dedicated work bringing justice for Caroline Brown. That's all we have to say right now." In the courthouse bathroom, Isabella splashed cold water on her face while Judith stood guard. "That woman has cancer," Isabella said to her reflection. "She's dying. Your mother died 34 years ago, at 34 years old." Judith's voice was hard. "Eleanor Whitfield got to live an entire life. Don't you dare waste sympathy on her." That night, Isabella couldn't sleep. She found herself driving through Millbrook at 2 a.m., the streets empty and strange in the darkness. She passed the elementary school where Eleanor had taught for 33 years before retiring in 2018. She passed First Methodist Church where Eleanor sang soprano in the choir. She passed Eleanor's house on Maple Street, a neat Cape Cod with flower boxes in the windows and a swing on the front porch. So normal, so ordinary, so incomprehensibly wrong. A patrol car pulled up beside her at a stoplight. Deputy Hayes rolled down his window. "Ms. Brown? You okay?" "Just driving. Can't sleep." "I understand. But maybe head home? You don't need to torture yourself driving past her house." Isabella hadn't realized she'd stopped in front of Eleanor's property. "How did you know that's what I was doing?" Hayes's smile was sad and knowing. "Because if I were you, I'd be doing the same thing. Trying to make sense of the senseless." The light changed. Isabella drove home, but Hayes's words stayed with her. Trying to make sense of the senseless. That's what she'd been doing for 34 years. Wasn't it? Constructing elaborate theories, searching for patterns, desperately needing the murder to mean something when perhaps it meant nothing at all. Perhaps Eleanor Whitfield had simply been broken in some fundamental way, and Caroline had been unlucky enough to be in her path. Friday brought the first major revelation. D.A. Washington held a press conference announcing they'd obtained Eleanor's journal from her house. The entries were cryptic, often incoherent, but several passages seemed to reference the murder. Washington read one aloud. Eleanor's words projected on a screen behind him. Asterisk, "The hardware woman thinks she knows everything. Thinks she's so perfect with her smile and her kindness and her bright, shiny life. But I see the truth. I see what she takes from me every day just by existing. The world loves her and looks through me, like I'm glass. October will be the month everything changes. October will be the month I stop being invisible." Asterisk. Isabella watched the press conference on her laptop, each word landing like a physical blow. The hardware woman. That's what Eleanor had called her mother. Reduced her to her job, her role, stripped away her humanity to make the unthinkable thinkable. But what had Caroline taken from Eleanor? What perceived slight or injury had festered into something so toxic it ended in murder? The town began to fracture. Lines were drawn, allegiances formed. Most people stood firmly behind the Brown family, but a vocal minority, former students, church members, longtime friends of Eleanor's, struggled to reconcile the woman they'd known with the crime she'd allegedly committed. On Saturday, Isabella went to the grocery store and found herself at the center of a confrontation she hadn't anticipated. She was in the produce section, examining tomatoes with more attention than they deserved, when a woman's voice cut through the background noise. "It's a witch hunt, that's what this is. Eleanor Whitfield is a good Christian woman who dedicated her life to children. And now they're destroying her based on some questionable DNA and a traumatized woman's recovered memories." Isabella looked up. The speaker was Diane Hartley, who'd taught third grade with Eleanor for 20 years. She was talking to another woman Isabella didn't recognize, but her voice was loud enough to carry through half the store. "DNA doesn't lie," the other woman said quietly. "DNA can be planted. Evidence can be fabricated." Diane's face was flushed, her hands gesturing sharply. "I've known Eleanor for 30 years. She couldn't hurt a fly. This is all some terrible mistake. And that poor woman is dying of cancer in a jail cell while everyone treats her like a monster." Isabella's hands tightened on her shopping cart. She should walk away. She should be the bigger person. But 34 years of grief and 3 days of revelation had stripped away her capacity for gracious silence. "My mother couldn't hurt a fly either," Isabella said, her voice carrying clearly. "But someone beat her to death with a blunt object. Someone crushed her skull so badly the mortician couldn't make her presentable for an open casket. Someone stole her wedding ring and her scarf and kept them like trophies for 34 years. The store had gone quiet. Diane Hartley turned, her face paling as she recognized Isabella. "So forgive me," Isabella continued, her voice shaking now but not with uncertainty, with rage pure and focused. "If I'm not concerned about whether Eleanor Whitfield is comfortable in her jail cell. Forgive me if I trust DNA evidence and a sheriff's department that actually did their job. And forgive me if I don't give a damn about your 30-year friendship when my mother has been dead in the ground for 34 years because of your good Christian friend." Isabella walked out, leaving her cart in the middle of the aisle, her groceries unpurchased. In the parking lot, her hands shook so badly she couldn't get her key in the ignition. She sat there for 5 minutes, breathing through waves of fury and shame. Shame for losing control, for making a scene, for caring what people like Diane Hartley thought. A tap on her window startled her. Patricia Chun stood outside, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail, her expression tentative but kind. "Ms. Brown? I'm Patricia. I'm the one who... I know who you are." Isabella rolled down the window. "I saw what happened in there. I wanted to say you were right, everything you said. And I'm sorry you had to say it." Patricia shifted her weight. "I'm also sorry for what I started. I know my coming forward made all this explode again. If you're angry at me, I'm not angry at you." Isabella's voice softened. "You did something incredibly brave. You could have stayed silent, protected yourself from all this. But you didn't." Patricia's eyes filled with tears. "I couldn't keep living with it. The not knowing, the wondering if what I remembered was real. My therapist said trauma buries things to protect us, but sometimes what's buried becomes more dangerous than the truth." They talked for 20 minutes in the parking lot. Two women connected by violence they didn't ask for and couldn't escape. Patricia described the years of nightmares, the substance abuse she'd fallen into in her 20s trying to quiet her mind, the hard work of recovery, and the even harder work of excavating memories she'd suppressed for self-preservation. "I remembered more after I spoke to the police," Patricia said. "Little details. Mrs. Whitfield was different that whole week before it happened. Agitated, distracted. She yelled at a student for something minor and then cried after. I thought she was having personal problems, but now..." She wrapped her arms around herself. "Now I think she was working up to it, building the courage or the rage or whatever it took to actually do it." Isabella absorbed this, another piece of the puzzle clicking into place. Premeditation. This hadn't been a sudden loss of control, a spontaneous act. Eleanor had planned it, prepared herself psychologically, crossed some internal threshold from thought to action. That made it worse somehow. The deliberateness of it. Sunday, Judith insisted Isabella come to church. "You haven't been in months, and right now you need community. You need people who knew Caroline and loved her to surround you." Isabella resisted. She'd been an ambivalent churchgoer at best since her 20s. But Judith's force of will was hard to resist. They attended First Baptist, not Methodist, Eleanor's church, and arrived late, slipping into a back pew just as the opening hymn began. Reverend Thomas Mitchell was 75, had known Caroline well, and devoted his sermon to the topic of justice and mercy. "We're called to forgive," he said, his voice carrying through the small sanctuary. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean excusing. It means releasing the poison of hatred from our own hearts so we can heal." Isabella felt the words like stones. Forgiveness. The concept felt foreign, impossible. How did you forgive someone who'd stolen your mother, your childhood, your sense of safety in the world? After the service, people approached her with awkward condolences, uncertain how to address a grief that had been reopened after decades. Mrs. Patterson, her neighbor, squeezed her hand. Marcus Webb, who'd run the local pharmacy since 1975, told her Caroline had been the kindest customer he'd ever served. Young parents with children who'd never known her mother offered sympathy that felt genuine even if abstract. But it was William Chen, Patricia's father, who said something that stuck with Isabella. He was a quiet man in his 60s, an accountant who'd raised Patricia alone after his wife died when Patricia was 12. "My daughter has been haunted by that day for 34 years, he said, his voice low. "She was 8 years old, and she saw something terrible. and her mind tried to protect her by hiding it away. But it was always there, poisoning her from the inside. I'm grateful to you for not blaming her for the pain this has brought back. Some people have. Your daughter is a victim too, Isabella said firmly. Eleanor Whitfield stole from both of us. Different things, but stolen all the same. That afternoon, Judith convinced Isabella to help her go through old photo albums. I think it might help, Judith said, to remember Caroline as she was, not just as the murder victim. They spread albums across Judith's dining room table. Decades of Brown family history in glossy prints. Caroline as a child, grinning gap-toothed at the camera. Caroline as a teenager, all long hair and bell-bottoms. Caroline pregnant with Isabella, one hand on her swollen belly, looking simultaneously terrified and radiant. Caroline holding newborn Isabella in the hospital, her face transformed by love, so profound it seemed to shine from the photograph. She wanted you so much, Judith said softly. After the divorce from Robert, everyone said she should wait, find someone new, settle down again. But Caroline said she'd waited long enough. She wanted to be a mother, and she didn't need a man to do it. You were her miracle baby, planned and chosen and celebrated. Isabella traced her mother's face in the photo. She'd heard the story before, but it meant something different now. Caroline had chosen single motherhood in 1981, when that was still scandalous in a town like Millbrook. She'd faced judgment, gossip, whispered speculation about her choices. But she'd persevered, built a life, raised a daughter, ran a business, all while being kind, being good, being the sort of person an entire town grieved when she died. And Eleanor Whitfield had looked at that life and felt. What? Envy? Rage? Some twisted sense of injustice? Do you have photos of Mrs. Whitfield? Isabella asked. From back then, Judith frowned. Probably. Why would you want to see them? I need to understand her, to see if there were signs we missed. They found a few, Eleanor at community events, always on the periphery, rarely in the center of the frame. Eleanor at a school function, her smile tight, her posture rigid. Eleanor and Caroline at a church fundraiser, standing side by side but not quite together. Caroline animated in conversation with someone off camera, while Eleanor stared at the photographer with an expression Isabella couldn't quite read. Resentment? Loneliness? Or was she projecting, seeing malice where there'd been nothing? Monday brought the preliminary hearing. D.A. Washington presented the evidence formally. The DNA results, the journal entries, Patricia's testimony, the timeline reconstruction showing Eleanor had been absent from school for 90 minutes during the window when Caroline was killed. A fact confirmed by school records showing she'd signed out for a personal emergency at 4:15 p.m. and returned at 5:45 p.m. Eleanor's attorney argued the evidence was circumstantial. The journal entries were vague, could be interpreted multiple ways. The DNA could have been transferred innocently. Patricia's memories were unreliable. The missing time could be explained. But the judge found probable cause. The case would proceed to trial, scheduled to begin in 6 weeks. Outside the courthouse, a small group of Eleanor's supporters had gathered with signs. Justice for Eleanor. Innocent until proven guilty. Free teacher wrongly accused. Isabella stared at the signs, feeling surreal. How could they stand there defending a woman who'd confessed in her own journal, whose DNA was on the murder weapon, who'd kept trophies from the crime? One of the protesters, a woman in her 50s, made eye contact with Isabella. Your mother was a good person, but so is Eleanor. This whole thing is a tragedy for everyone. A tragedy is a natural disaster, Isabella said coldly. This was murder. There's a difference. That night, Isabella received a Facebook message from someone named Jennifer Kowalski. The profile picture showed a woman in her early 40s with kind eyes and a warm smile. Ms. Brown, I hope this isn't intrusive, but I felt compelled to reach out. I was Mrs. Whitfield's student in 1989 to 1990, 2 years before your mother's death. I want you to know that she wasn't a good teacher. She wasn't kind. She was cruel in subtle ways, the kind that left marks you couldn't see. She had favorites and targets, and if you were a target, school became hell. I was overweight, shy, and she made every day a nightmare. Comments about my size disguised as health concern. Public humiliation for wrong answers. A coldness that made me feel worthless. The message continued, detailing years of emotional abuse that had left Jennifer with anxiety and self-esteem issues that persisted into adulthood. She'd been in therapy for a decade. And when she'd seen the news about Eleanor's arrest, something had clicked. People who can be that cruel to children, who can derive satisfaction from hurting the vulnerable, they're capable of much worse than we want to believe. I'm not surprised she killed someone. I'm only surprised it took so long. Please know that many of her former students are not mourning her incarceration. Some of us are relieved. Isabella shared the message with Judith, who read it with mounting fury. I wish I'd known, Judith said. I would have raised hell. Your mama never would have been friends with someone who hurt children. Maybe she didn't know. Maybe Eleanor was good at hiding it. Or maybe she saved her cruelty for people who couldn't fight back. Judith's jaw tightened. Cowards always do. Over the next week, more messages came. Former students with similar stories. Parents who'd tried to complain but been dismissed. A pattern emerging of a woman who wielded power over the vulnerable while maintaining a veneer of respectability for those who mattered. The picture of Eleanor Whitfield was being redrawn in darker colors. Not just a murderer, but someone whose cruelty had been present all along, visible to those who looked closely but easily dismissed by those who didn't want to see. Wednesday afternoon, Sheriff Williams called Isabella to the station. When she arrived, he led her to a conference room where DA Washington waited with several file folders spread across the table. We've uncovered something else, Washington said without preamble. Financial records showing Eleanor made several large cash deposits in the months after your mother's death. $15,000 total, deposited in increments of $2,000 to $3,000. Isabella's mind raced. You think she robbed the store? But the register wasn't touched. The register wasn't. But your mother kept a safe in the back office, we know from police reports. It was open when her body was found. Empty. At the time, your aunt couldn't confirm what had been in it. Judith had arrived and was sitting beside Isabella. Caroline kept the week's deposits there, she said slowly. She only went to the bank on Fridays. It was Tuesday when her voice cracked. There could have been $5,000, maybe more. She'd had a busy week. A big contractor order came in. So this wasn't just personal, Isabella said, the realization settling heavy in her chest. It was also robbery. We think the personal motive was primary, Washington clarified. But Eleanor saw an opportunity to solve her financial problems while settling whatever score she thought she had with your mother. Kill two birds with one stone. The phrase made Isabella flinch. Kill. Such a small word for such an immense act. Washington continued. Eleanor's credit card statements from 1991 show she was in serious debt. Medical bills from her mother's cancer treatment. A balloon payment due on a loan. She was desperate. And your mother, successful, financially stable. Must have seemed like she had everything Eleanor lacked. It made a terrible kind of sense. Envy mixed with desperation. Resentment mixed with need. Caroline had become a symbol of everything wrong in Eleanor's life. And killing her had solved problems both psychological and practical. There's one more thing, Williams said, sliding a photograph across the table. We found this in Eleanor's attic. It was a photo of Caroline, taken at the hardware store. She was laughing at something, her face caught in a moment of pure joy. But the photo was damaged. Caroline's face scratched out, deep gouges from what looked like a key or knife, her features obliterated. Isabella felt bile rise in her throat. The hatred required to do that, to physically destroy an image, to scratch out someone's face again and again, spoke to a rage that went beyond reason. I wanted you to see it before the trial, Washington said gently. So you're prepared. The defense will try to humanize Eleanor, paint her as desperate and mentally ill, make the jury feel sympathy. But this shows premeditation and malice. This shows she hated your mother enough to deface her image, likely multiple times over the years. Isabella stared at the ruined photograph. In the parts that remained intact, she could see her mother's smile, the crinkle at the corners of her eyes. the vitality that had been stolen from the world on October 15, 1991. "Use it," Isabella said, her voice steady. "Use everything. I want that jury to see exactly who Eleanor Whitfield is and what she took from us." That night, Isabella stood in her backyard under a clear sky full of stars that her mother would never see. The January air was bitter, frost forming on the grass, her breath misting in front of her face. Somewhere in a cell, Eleanor Whitfield lay on a narrow cot, her body ravaged by cancer, her secrets finally exposed. Did she feel remorse? Fear? Or was she still convinced, after all these years, that she'd been justified somehow? Isabella would never understand that. The workings of a mind that could look at Caroline Brown, kind, hard-working, beloved Caroline, and see an enemy worth destroying. But understanding wasn't necessary for justice. And justice finally was coming. The trial began on March 1st, 8 weeks after Eleanor Whitfield's arrest. The Davidson County Courthouse had never seen such attention. National media outlets had picked up the story, the wholesome small-town teacher, the decades-old cold case, the DNA breakthrough. It had all the elements of a primetime documentary. Isabella attended every day, sitting in the same spot in the front row, Judith beside her on the left and Sophia on her right. Her daughter had insisted on coming home from Vanderbilt for the trial, dropping her spring semester classes to be there. "Grades can wait," Sophia had said firmly. "This can't." The jury selection had taken 3 days. D.A. Washington wanted people who understood the weight of evidence, who wouldn't be swayed by Eleanor's age or illness. The defense wanted people with sympathy, people who could believe in reasonable doubt. They ended up with 12 Davidson County residents. 8 women, for men, ages ranging from 24 to 67, a cross-section of rural Tennessee. Judge Holland ran a tight courtroom. No cameras inside, no outbursts, strict time limits on arguments. She was fair but fierce, and Isabella felt grateful for her no-nonsense approach. Washington's opening statement was devastating in its clarity. He walked the jury through the evidence piece by piece. The timeline, the DNA, the journal entries, the defaced photograph, the stolen money. He painted a picture of a woman consumed by envy and desperation who'd planned and executed a brutal murder, then lived with it for 34 years. Caroline Brown was 34 years old when she died, Washington said, his voice resonating through the courtroom. The same age Eleanor Whitfield was at the time. 2 women, same age, but living vastly different lives. Caroline was a single mother running a successful business, beloved in her community, raising a daughter with love and care. Eleanor was drowning in debt, trapped in a job she found unfulfilling, caring for a dying mother, looking at her life and seeing only what she lacked. He paused, letting the words settle. Envy is one of the 7 deadly sins. And on October 15, 1991, envy turned deadly in the most literal sense. The defense's opening was softer, more emotional. Rebecca Morrison acknowledged the tragedy of Caroline's death, but insisted the state's case was built on circumstantial evidence and speculation. Eleanor Whitfield is a 70-year-old woman dying of cancer who devoted 43 years to educating children. The state wants you to believe she's a monster based on DNA that could have been transferred innocently, journal entries that are vague and open to interpretation, and the recovered memories of a traumatized witness. But Eleanor Whitfield is innocent, and we will prove the state cannot meet the burden of beyond a reasonable doubt. The first week was all forensics. The DNA expert explained how Caroline's blood and tissue had been found on the scarf, mixed with Eleanor's epithelial cells in a pattern consistent with Eleanor having worn the scarf while blood was actively being shed. The medical examiner walked through the autopsy findings. Caroline had been struck 7 times with a rounded metal object, each blow delivered with significant force. Death had likely come on the 4th blow, but the killer had continued, suggesting rage rather than simple intent to kill. Isabella sat through it all, her face a mask, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles turned white. Sophia held her mother's hand, squeezing tight when the details became particularly graphic. Judith took notes, her mouth a thin line of controlled fury. On the 4th day, Patricia Chen took the stand. She was visibly nervous, her hands shaking as she was sworn in. But once Washington began asking questions, her voice steadied. "Tell us about October 15th, 1991, Washington said gently. Patricia took a breath. It was a Tuesday. I was in Mrs. Whitfield's 5th grade class. It was a normal day until around 4 p.m. Mrs. Whitfield seemed agitated during the last period. She kept looking at the clock, and she snapped at a student for asking a question. When the final bell rang, she told us to pack up quickly. She seemed in a hurry to leave. And what did you observe after school? I had stayed late because my dad was running late picking me up. I was in the hallway waiting when I saw Mrs. Whitfield come out of the teacher's lounge. She was wearing a long cardigan, but her sleeve was pushed up, and I saw what looked like blood on her forearm. What did you do? I asked if she was okay. She looked startled, then pulled her sleeve down and said it was paint from the art room. She said she'd helped clean up after the art class. Patricia's voice wavered. But we hadn't had art that day, and I remember thinking the color was wrong. Too dark for any paint we used. Did you tell anyone? I told my dad when he picked me up. He said I must have been mistaken, that teachers didn't hurt themselves at school. I wanted to believe him. Tears tracked down Patricia's face. For years, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. But when Mrs. Brown's murder was on the news that night, I had nightmares. Terrible nightmares about blood and screaming. My dad took me to a counselor, and eventually the nightmares stopped. I thought I'd moved past it. But you hadn't? No. The memory was buried, but it was always there, affecting me in ways I didn't understand. Anxiety, panic attacks, difficulty trusting people. It wasn't until I started trauma therapy in my 30s that the memory began to resurface fully. Morrison's cross-examination was aggressive. She hammered on the reliability of recovered memories, citing studies showing how easily false memories could be implanted. She suggested Patricia's therapist had influenced her, that she'd seen the news about the case being reopened and manufactured a memory to insert herself into the narrative. But Patricia held firm. I know what I saw. I've spent 34 years trying not to know, but I can't unknow it anymore. The second week brought Eleanor's journal entries. Washington read them aloud, each one more damning than the last. She doesn't even see me when I speak to her. I'm invisible, a ghost haunting my own life. The hardware woman bought a new car. Of course she did. While I'm drowning, she's buying cars and wearing expensive clothes and smiling like life is easy. I dream about making her understand what it's like to be powerless, to be nothing. October 15th. It has to be October 15th. A Tuesday. The store will be quiet. The final entry was dated October 16th, 1991. It's done. She'll never look through me again. Never smile that superior smile. Never have what I can't have. I thought I'd feel guilty, but I just feel free. Finally free. The courtroom was silent when Washington finished reading. Several jurors looked shaken. One woman in the back row was crying. Morrison tried to argue the entries were creative writing, a way Eleanor processed her frustrations. My client kept a journal for emotional release. These entries reflect feelings, not actions. We all have dark thoughts sometimes. That doesn't make us murderers. But the prosecution's handwriting expert testified that the entries were written at the times indicated by the dates, not retroactively. The October 15th entry had been written before the murder, the October 16th entry after. This was documentation of premeditation and confession. On the 8th day, they called James Winters, who'd been Eleanor's colleague at Millbrook Elementary in 1991. He was 70 now, retired to Florida, and he'd flown in specifically to testify. Eleanor was unstable that fall, he said. She'd always been high-strung, but something was different. She made comments about Caroline Brown constantly, criticizing her, saying she thought she was better than everyone, that she'd gotten lucky in life while Eleanor had worked hard for nothing. Did she specifically mention Mrs. Brown by name? Washington asked. Oh yes. She'd drive past the hardware store on her way home and come in the next day fuming about how busy it was, how successful Caroline was. She seemed obsessed. Morrison objected, speculation. But the judge allowed the testimony as observation of Eleanor's state of mind. The financial evidence came next. Forensic accountants tracked Eleanor's spending after the murder. Debt payments, her mother's medical bills, a used car purchase. The money had evaporated quickly, but its source seemed clear. Judith testified about the safe in Caroline's office, confirming it had likely contained several $1,000s. Caroline was meticulous about money. She deposited every Friday without fail. That Tuesday was 3 days before deposit day, and she'd had a major contractor sale on Monday. There would have been at least $5,000 in that safe. Isabella herself was called on day 10. Walking to the witness stand felt surreal, like moving through water. She was sworn in, her hand on the Bible, her voice steady as she promised to tell the truth. Washington's questions were gentle, establishing her relationship with her mother, the family business, what Caroline had been like as a person and parent. "Tell us about the last time you saw your mother alive," Washington said. Isabella's throat tightened. "It was that Tuesday morning, October 15th. Mama was running late. She'd been up late the night before doing inventory. I was getting ready for school, and she was trying to make my lunch and return a customer's phone call at the same time. She was always like that, trying to do everything for everyone." "What did she say to you?" "Love you, baby. Be good." The words came out thick with tears Isabella had promised herself she wouldn't shed on the stand. "Those were the last words she ever said to me, and I didn't say them back. I was 9 and in a hurry to catch the bus. And I just waved and ran out the door." "And when did you learn something was wrong?" "Aunt Judith picked me up from school that day instead of Mama. She looked strange, scared. She took me to her house and sat me down and told me Mama had been hurt, that she was gone." Isabella's voice broke. "I didn't understand at first. Gone where? When was she coming back?" It took a long time to understand that she was never coming back. Morrison's cross-examination was brief and respectful. She expressed condolences for Isabella's loss and asked only a few questions about whether Isabella had ever witnessed any interaction between Eleanor and Caroline that seemed hostile. "I don't remember them interacting much at all," Isabella admitted. "Mrs. Whitfield wasn't a close friend. She was just around. Church, at school events. Background noise in our lives." "So you never saw any indication that Mrs. Whitfield harbored ill will toward your mother?" "No. But I was 9 years old. I wouldn't have recognized the signs even if they were there." The defense's case began on day 12. Morrison called character witnesses, former students who'd loved Eleanor, church members who'd benefited from her volunteer work, fellow teachers who described her as dedicated and kind. But Washington's cross-examinations revealed cracks. Several witnesses admitted they'd lost touch with Eleanor in recent years. Others acknowledged they'd heard rumors of her being difficult or particular. One former colleague slipped and mentioned that Eleanor could hold a grudge, something fierce if she felt wronged. Morrison tried to introduce Eleanor's cancer diagnosis as a mitigating factor, suggesting her deteriorating health had contributed to her arrest, that she'd been confused, perhaps not thinking clearly when she kept the scarf and ring. But the prosecution's medical expert testified that ovarian cancer didn't typically cause the kind of cognitive impairment that would explain keeping murder trophies for decades. On day 14, the moment Isabella had been both dreading and anticipating arrived. Eleanor Whitfield herself took the stand. She looked frail in her orange jumpsuit, her gray hair thin, her face gaunt from cancer treatment. Morrison had clearly coached her to appear sympathetic, small, sick, harmless. Under Morrison's questioning, Eleanor painted herself as a victim of circumstance. Yes, she'd been jealous of Caroline. Yes, she'd written those journal entries. Yes, she'd struggled with dark thoughts. "But I didn't kill her," Eleanor said, her voice small. "I was angry and bitter and not in a good place mentally. But I didn't kill her." "How do you explain your DNA on the scarf?" Morrison asked. "Caroline let me borrow it once, months before she died. I admired it at church, and she insisted I take it home for a few days. I must have gotten my skin cells on it then. And the ring. I don't know how it got in my attic. Someone must have planted it." The answers sounded rehearsed, hollow. But Eleanor delivered them with conviction, meeting the jury's eyes, her hands folded demurely in her lap. Then Washington stood for cross-examination, and the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted. Ms. Whitfield, you testified you didn't kill Caroline Brown. That's correct. But you wrote in your journal, it's done. She'll never look through me again. What did you mean by that? Eleanor hesitated. It was a fantasy, a way of processing my anger. A fantasy you wrote the day after Caroline Brown was murdered? Coincidence. Washington smiled without warmth. Let's talk about October 15, 1991. You signed out of school at 4:15 p.m. for a personal emergency. What was the emergency? I don't remember. It was 34 years ago. You don't remember an emergency important enough to leave work 90 minutes early? No. School records show you returned at 5:45 p.m. Where did you go? I told you, I don't remember. Caroline Brown was killed between 4:30 and 5:30 p.m. You have no alibi for that exact time period. That doesn't mean I killed her. Washington pulled out the defaced photograph. Do you recognize this? Eleanor's composure cracked. Her eyes widened, and for a moment, something raw flashed across her face. Fear, maybe, or recognition of how damning the image was. This is a photograph of Caroline Brown that we found in your attic. Her face has been scratched out. Violently. Repeatedly. Did you do this? No. It was in your attic, Ms. Whitfield. In a box with your belongings. Who else would have done it? I don't know. Someone trying to frame me. Someone broke into your house, planted a defaced photograph in Caroline's ring and scarf. All to frame you for a 34-year-old murder? Washington's voice dripped with skepticism. Does that sound reasonable to you? Eleanor's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The jury looked skeptical, several members shaking their heads slightly. Washington pressed harder. You envied Caroline Brown, didn't you? Sometimes, yes. You resented her success. She had things I didn't. That was hard. Hard enough to kill her for? Objection. Withdrawn. Washington changed tactics. You took money from her safe. No. You deposited $15,000 in the months after her death. Where did that money come from? I sold some things. Furniture, jewelry. We investigated that claim. You have no receipts, no record of sales, no witnesses to these transactions. It was cash, private sales. How convenient. The cross-examination lasted 3 hours. By the end, Eleanor looked exhausted and cornered. Her story had holes big enough to drive trucks through, and the jury could see it. Closing arguments came on day 16. Morrison gave it her best effort, hammering on reasonable doubt, the circumstantial nature of the evidence, the tragedy of convicting a dying woman on insufficient proof. But Washington's closing was a masterclass. He wove together every piece of evidence into a coherent narrative. Eleanor's envy, her financial desperation, her opportunity, the violence of the crime, the trophies kept for decades, the journal confessions. Caroline Brown was beaten to death in her own place of business by someone she knew and trusted, Washington said, his voice ringing through the courtroom. Someone who'd looked her in the eye at church, who'd smiled at her daughter, who'd pretended to be a friend while harboring murderous rage. Eleanor Whitfield killed Caroline Brown for money and for the satisfaction of destroying someone she envied. She took a mother from her child. She took a daughter from her mother. She took a sister from her family. And then she went back to teaching children, living her life, as if Caroline's life meant nothing. He paused, looking at each juror in turn. Don't let her get away with it for one more day. Give Caroline Brown the justice she's waited 34 years to receive. The jury deliberated for 11 hours over 2 days. Isabella barely ate, barely slept, living in a state of suspended animation where time felt both endless and non-existent. When word came that the jury had reached a verdict, Isabella's heart nearly stopped. They filed into the courtroom on a gray Friday afternoon. Judge Holland asked if they'd reached a verdict. The foreperson, a black woman in her 50s named Denise Johnson, stood. We have, Your Honor. What say you? On the charge of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Eleanor Whitfield, guilty. The word guilty echoed through Isabella's entire body. Sophia grabbed her hand. Judith let out a sob. Behind them, someone cheered before being shushed by the bailiff. Eleanor Whitfield sat motionless, her face blank, as if she'd already left her body. Judge Holland thanked the jury and set sentencing for 3 weeks later. As the bailiffs led Eleanor away, she turned and looked directly at Isabella for the first time since the trial began. Their eyes met across the courtroom. And in that moment, Isabella saw something she'd been searching for throughout the trial, not remorse exactly, but acknowledgement. A flicker of something human beneath the mask, a recognition of what had been done and what it had cost. Then Eleanor was gone, led back to her cell, and Isabella was surrounded by people. Judith crying, Sophia hugging her, Sheriff Williams offering congratulations, D.A. Washington shaking her hand, reporters shouting questions she couldn't hear over the roaring in her ears. Outside the courthouse, the March afternoon was unseasonably warm. Spring was coming to Tennessee, dogwoods beginning to bloom, the air carrying the scent of possibility. Isabella stood on the steps, Judith on one side and Sophia on the other, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not quite peace, not yet, but perhaps the first movement toward it. A reporter from the Nashville Tennessean approached with a microphone. Ms. Brown, how do you feel about the verdict? Isabella took a breath. Grateful. To the jury, to the sheriff's department, to Patricia Chun for her bravery, to everyone who worked to bring truth to light after all these years. My mother can rest now. And maybe our family can too. That night, the 3 generations of Brown women sat together in Judith's living room. They ordered pizza, opened a bottle of wine, sparkling cider for Sophia, and let themselves simply exist in the aftermath. What happens now? Sophia asked. Sentencing in 3 weeks, Isabella said. Then appeals, probably years of them. But the trial is over. The truth is out. Do you think she'll say why? Sophia's question was quiet, tentative. Actually explain what made her do it? Isabella shook her head. I don't think she knows herself. People like Eleanor, they build narratives to justify their actions, but underneath it's just brokenness looking for somewhere to land. Mama was convenient, successful, kind, everything Eleanor felt she wasn't. So she became the target. That's not fair, Sophia said fiercely. No, Judith agreed. It's not. But fairness isn't something we're guaranteed in this life. What we're guaranteed is choice, how we respond to unfairness, how we carry it, whether we let it destroy us or whether we survive it. They talked late into the night about Caroline, about the trial, about what justice meant and whether they truly found it. Around midnight, Sophia fell asleep on the couch, her head on Isabella's shoulder, and Isabella sat there holding her daughter, thinking about the chain of mothers and daughters that violence had tried to break but hadn't quite managed. 3 weeks later, Eleanor Whitfield was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Given her cancer diagnosis, it was essentially a death sentence. Judge Holland showed no mercy. You took Caroline Brown's life with brutal violence, the judge said. You stole her daughter's mother, her family's loved one, this community's friend. You showed no remorse for 34 years. The court shows you none now. Eleanor died 7 months later in the prison medical unit. Isabella received the news via a phone call from Sheriff Williams. She felt nothing at first. No satisfaction, no grief, just a strange emptiness where all the anger had been. It's over, she told Sophia when she called to share the news. How do you feel? Isabella considered the question. Like a book I've been reading my entire life just ended, and now I have to figure out what to read next. The months after Eleanor's death felt like learning to walk on new legs. Isabella had spent 34 years defined by her mother's unsolved murder, and now that the case was resolved, she had to discover who she was without that central organizing principle of injustice and unanswered questions. On October 15, 1991, in the quiet town of Millbrook, Tennessee, 9-year-old Isabella Brown's world shattered in an instant. Her mother, Caroline Brown, a beloved hardware store owner known throughout the community for her kindness and generosity, was brutally murdered in what appeared to be a robbery gone wrong. The killer took $347 from the cash register, along with Caroline's distinctive autumn scarf and sapphire ring, then vanished into the shadows, leaving behind a devastated family and a town in mourning. For 34 years, the case went cold. But the truth, as it always does, eventually found its way into the light. Caroline Brown was more than just a murder victim. She was the heart of Millbrook, a woman who ran her family's hardware store with a philosophy that put people before profits. She extended credit to those struggling financially, never pressuring them for payment but trusting they'd make things right when they could. She helped children with school projects, patiently explaining each step. She welcomed newcomers to town, making them feel at home in a place where they were uncertain of their welcome. She sang terribly off-key while working, filling the hardware store with her joyful noise. She believed in second chances, hard work, and treating everyone with dignity. She saw the best in people, sometimes to her detriment as it would tragically turn out. Caroline raised her daughter Isabella as a single mother after her husband's death, creating a life filled with love, laughter, and the simple pleasures of small-town living. She had no idea that someone in her own community harbored a darkness that would ultimately destroy her. Isabella was supposed to stay at a friend's house that October evening. But when the sleepover was canceled, she came home earlier than expected. What she witnessed in those next moments would haunt her for decades. Fragments of memory too terrible for a child's mind to fully process. The police investigation turned up little. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no suspects. Just a grieving 9-year-old girl and her Aunt Judith, left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. Isabella's response to the trauma was to flee. She spent the next 3 decades running from Millbrook and the memories it held, building a life in Memphis that was safe, predictable, and emotionally distant. She had a daughter, Sophia, raised her well, but kept the past locked away in a box she refused to open. She became a legal secretary, efficient and competent, but never truly present, always 1 foot out the door, always ready to run. Then came the phone call that would change everything. In March 2024, Sheriff Williams contacted Isabella with news. Advances in DNA technology had finally identified Caroline's killer. The name sent shockwaves through the community. Eleanor Whitfield, a retired elementary school teacher, a churchgoer, a woman who had seemed to embody small-town respectability for decades. Eleanor had been there all along. She'd attended Caroline's funeral. She'd taught children in the same school Isabella had attended. She'd lived a seemingly normal life while carrying the secret of her crime, the stolen scarf and ring hidden in her attic like trophies of her undetected violence. The arrest was dramatic. Eleanor collapsed, suffering a stroke that would eventually claim her life. But before she died, during the trial and in a final letter, she provided answers to the question that had haunted Isabella for 34 years. Why? The answer was devastating in its banality. Eleanor killed Caroline not because of abuse, mental illness, or dramatic circumstances beyond her control. She killed her because of envy, pure, poisonous envy that she allowed to consume her until it crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Eleanor hated her own life and saw Caroline as representing everything she couldn't have. Caroline's happiness, success, and contentment felt like a personal affront. Every time Caroline smiled, Eleanor perceived it as a mockery of her own failures. Even though Caroline had never been cruel or dismissive, it was all in Eleanor's twisted perception. She planned the murder for months, convincing herself that Caroline somehow deserved it. She stole the money because she told herself Caroline had more than enough. She kept the scarf and ring as proof of her own courage to take what she wanted. Then she simply lived with it, teaching children, attending church, pretending to be normal. And it was easier than anyone might think because humans are remarkably skilled at lying to themselves. The trial was a media sensation, but for Isabella, it was something more profound, a reckoning with decades of suppressed trauma. She had to face not only the details of her mother's death, but also her own fragmented memories of that terrible night. The courtroom became a place where past and present collided, where a 9-year-old's testimony from 1991 was weighed against DNA evidence from 2024. During the proceedings, Isabella connected with Patricia Chun, another woman who'd been affected by the case. Someone who'd witnessed Eleanor burning evidence years earlier, but had suppressed the memory until the arrest triggered its return. Together, they navigated the complicated landscape of recovered memories and survivors' guilt, finding solidarity in their shared experience. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on all counts. But before Eleanor could serve significant time, she died from complications of her stroke, taking with her any possibility of full accountability. Yet she left behind that final letter, a confession that provided closure even as it revealed the heartbreaking ordinariness of her motivation. Isabella could have let the anger consume her. She could have remained trapped in the victim role, defined forever by what was taken from her. Instead, she made a different choice, a choice her mother would have been proud of. She stayed in Millbrook, the town she'd spent decades avoiding. She enrolled in a grief counseling certification program, reasoning that if she had to carry this pain, she might as well learn to help others carry theirs. She connected with other loss survivors and discovered a truth that would guide her forward. You don't fill the hole that loss creates, and you don't forget it. You simply build a life wide enough and strong enough to hold both the loss and the living. On the first anniversary of Eleanor's arrest, Isabella organized a community service event in Caroline's name, volunteers gathering to do repairs for elderly residents who couldn't afford contractors. It was exactly the kind of practical, unglamorous help Caroline would have offered, and it marked the beginning of Isabella's transformation. Using money from her mother's estate that had sat untouched for decades, Isabella purchased a building on Main Street and converted it into a community counseling center offering free and sliding scale services. She named it the Caroline Brown Center for Healing and Hope, honoring her mother's legacy by continuing her work of helping people. The opening in April 2026, 2 years after Eleanor's arrest, was attended by half the town. But the moment that truly mattered came 3 weeks later when Isabella's first client walked through the door. A teenage girl whose father had been murdered, who needed someone to understand that you don't get over this kind of loss, you just get through it. You understand, the girl said, hope flickering in her eyes for the first time since her father's death. I do, Isabella replied, and in that moment, she understood something profound. Her mother's death had been senseless and brutal, but the life Isabella built from the wreckage didn't have to be. She could take the pain and transmute it into purpose. She could be the person she'd needed when she was 9 years old and the world fell apart. Over the following years, the center expanded and flourished. Isabella hired additional therapists, including Dr. Sarah Martinez, who specialized in childhood trauma. Judith, Isabella's aunt, retired at 70 and volunteered at the center, managing administrative work with her particular brand of fierce warmth. The center served trauma survivors, domestic violence victims, and families navigating loss, eventually helping over 100 clients annually. Isabella led support groups for families of homicide victims, sharing her own story not to center herself but to offer the credibility of lived experience. The town of Millbrook honored Caroline's memory in other ways too. A small park on Main Street was renamed Caroline Brown Memorial Park, with a bench and plaque commemorating her life and contribution to the community. The dedication ceremony brought together people who'd known Caroline, each sharing stories that wove a picture of a life that mattered beyond the violence of its ending. Isabella's daughter Sophia, inspired by watching her mother transform pain into purpose, pursued a degree in social work and eventually wrote a book about the case. Not exploitatively, but as an exploration of how families heal after violence. She married a trauma nurse named Michael who understood, implicitly, the weight of loss her family carried. Their daughter, Caroline Grace, was named for the grandmother she'd never meet. Growing up, she knew about loss and healing and the importance of turning pain into purpose. But she also knew joy, security, and the simple pleasure of a grandmother pushing her on a swing. She volunteered at the center from age 12 and eventually created a documentary podcast about the case and its aftermath. 3 generations of strong brown women, each carrying forward Caroline's legacy of kindness and community service in their own way. 25 years after Eleanor's arrest, as Isabella approached 70, she had transformed not just herself but an entire community's understanding of trauma and healing. The Caroline Brown Center had become a model for community-based trauma recovery, written up in journals, featured in documentaries, visited by counselors from across the country. The Dollar General building where Caroline had been murdered was renovated into a historical museum, with a wing dedicated to her life and the Brown family business. Caroline's autumn scarf, the one stained with blood and used as evidence, was professionally restored, the blood stains removed, the fabric repaired, and framed alongside a photograph of Caroline wearing it. This scarf was both a symbol of violence and a key to justice. The museum placard read, "Its recovery helped solve a 34-year-old murder and bring peace to a family. It reminds us that even the darkest chapters can close, and that truth, however long delayed, eventually emerges." On the 59th anniversary of Caroline's death, Isabella visited her mother's grave and spoke aloud, "I'm old now, Mama. Older than you ever got to be. That feels strange. But I've lived a good life. Not an easy one, but a good one. And I've tried to honor you by being kind, by helping people, by refusing to let bitterness win." For the first time in 59 years, when she said she was good, she meant it completely. This is the story we bring you on The Truth Echoes. Stories of cold cases solved, of justice delayed but not denied, of families who refuse to let violence have the final word. We believe that every victim deserves to be remembered not just for how they died, but for how they lived. We believe that truth matters, even when it takes decades to emerge. We believe that healing is possible, even from the deepest wounds. Caroline Brown's murder was senseless. Eleanor Whitfield's crime was born of ordinary human darkness. Envy and bitterness allowed to fester until it became fatal. But the story doesn't end with that darkness. It ends with light, with a daughter who turned her trauma into a tool for healing others, with a community that learned to honor the dead by serving the living, with generations of women who carry forward a legacy of strength and compassion. The legacy of Caroline Brown lives on in Millbrook, Tennessee. In the park that bears her name, in the center that helps trauma survivors heal, in the generations of strong women who carry her kindness forward, and in a community that learned justice, though delayed, still matters. If you've been moved by Isabella's journey from that traumatized 9-year-old to a woman who built something beautiful from terrible loss, subscribe to the Truth Echoes podcast. We bring you stories where silence is never forgotten, where cold cases find resolution, where families find peace, and where truth, no matter how long it takes, eventually prevails. Subscribe today on your favorite podcast platform and join us as we explore the cases that remind us why truth matters, why justice matters, and why the human capacity for resilience never stops being extraordinary.